Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Humo SOS show. And glad to be back. And we're going to have a good discussion today. Hope you'll join us. Be sure as you join us to let us know where you're joining from. And we always love to hear your questions and comments as part of the show. It makes the show much better. So, Anton, you want to open us up with the topic today?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for joining. If you're new to our show, if you're new to Kevin and I, we'll just introduce ourselves. Kevin and I run this Human SOS show, but ultimately we run Perspective Force, which is a company focused on human sustainability, and that's what this show is all about. When it comes down to human sustainability, it's a concept that many people don't necessarily see in the same way. So I just want to explain really quick what we mean by human sustainability. And the best way I could describe that is by looking at our planet, for example. So, our planet, we used resources and we didn't pay attention to, hey, at the rate that we're using these resources, when are we going to run out? Is there such thing? Until, very recently, in comparison to how long we've been using these resources. Well, the same thing applies to our human body, our mind, our soul, our spirit, all these things. And what we have to look at is how fast are we using our own resources, right? And the thing is, the reality of the situation is many of you, I would say most of you, depending on where you live in the world, are using up what you should use in a day as a human being from, standpoint of how much load you put on your brain, how much you put on your body, different things like that. By noon, you're using what you should use in a day, right?
Mm.
Like that's the reality of what we're looking at. And that's not sustainable long term. Just yesterday I saw an article talking about how ADHD is on the rise and it's really growing exponentially. People are struggling to keep up. Well, guess what? That's just a sign of us living unsustainably, and there's many symptoms that are tied into that. So that's what Human SOS show is about. That's what Perspective Force is about. We help companies kind of live and work in a more humanly sustainable way. But today we're going to talk about the stress of layoffs. And Kevin asked me for a topic, and this came to mind because I've dealt with this on both ends of the spectrum. Not where I had to lay off, but I've had clients who had to lay off, right? And I had to coach the company executives through the layoff process. And I've also been on the other end of it where I was either fired or I was laid off, or I'm scared, like many of you are, of layoffs. And that's where we are right now as human beings. I think many of us are looking at macroeconomical conditions and we're seeing how many layoffs are happening in tech. We're also seeing that economy is uncertain and we are very, very stressed out about the potential of us being laid off if we're working for large corporations or if we're working for somebody else and we're not necessarily a solopreneur, entrepreneur, or a gig worker of some sort. Have you noticed the layoffs, Kev? I know that you're probably not as much in danger of that kind of stuff as I am, but is that something that's been on your mind?
Oh yeah, I was noticing a headline came through uh, yesterday, day before Disney round two of layoffs, and so yeah, a lot of layoffs occurring. I think that we're still uh, economically trying to adjust to the pandemic and the fallout from all that, and a lot of companies and organizations trying to figure out how they can sustain into the future, and so unfortunately layoffs are part of that landscape, and it's something that even if you're not haven't been laid off, the potential looming that you might be, and even as a an entrepreneur, the effect that this potentially has on us as contractors of for other companies and things, because we may not get laid off, but the equivalent is a non-renewable renewal of a contract, or a deduction, I'm sorry, reduction in the contract, whatever. So yeah, it's definitely out there and something that's on a lot of people's minds.
Mhm.
Uh, Let me welcome Rick and Eunice, as always, and the Indian Academy of Entrepreneurial. I believe that's our friend VJ. So, welcome aboard. Look forward to hearing your comments and questions as we address this topic of the stresses in and around layoffs. and noted that that stress is can be just as great for those that are having to do the layoffs, as Anton shared about helping with companies as they work through it. It's not something done lightly. I know one of the hardest things as a business owner I've ever done is to have to lay off or fire people. And even if even if it's deserved, it's still painful to do.
Mhm. No, absolutely. And the first thing, maybe since we already started, let's start on the topic that most people don't talk about, and that's the company side of layoffs, right? So this client I worked with had to lay off, I think 20, close to 23%, something like that of
Well,
his workforce, large amount of people. And I've just seen this man, I see him regularly, right? And I just seen him deteriorate over time because of how stressed he was. And he is genuinely a great leader. Like I think that he puts his people's first. Kevin, you talk about servant leadership a lot. I think he's really a definition of that and does all the things the right way. But unfortunately, it came to a point where their company just didn't have enough business. They weren't getting the contracts that they used to be getting, and things had to be downsized. And this is where some people say, well, you should have planned for that. Well, it's a medium-sized business, right? It's not a small business, but it's a medium-sized business, and things are great for a long time. So yes, they weren't necessarily growing like a Facebook or something like that, some exponential turn, levels like that. But they were trying to grow when the opportunity was there, and he tried his hardest to stay in the game with his people and keep them there as long as he could. But then it came to a point where if I don't make this hard choice, I'm not going to have a company anymore. So it's not just the 23%, it's the other, 67% or whatever is my math there, and 77,
no, 77.
77% is going to have to be laid off, right? And that's the tough part. So as an owner, my advice to people is just to do it in a good humanly way, in a good humanly sustainable way, whatever we want to call
There
it.
you
And what I mean by that is how you let those 23% go is going to not just affect the 23%, it's going to affect the other people that are
go.
watching, that are seeing, right? Like all of a sudden, are they going to have to take more workload that the other 23% were carrying? And now you're going to burn out those others. Or is it truly that the work is not there and you're not going to burden those other people with it, but there's still the emotional side of it? And how
Mhm.
are you going to address it? Are you going to go about it like, hush hush? And I've seen that happen where layoffs are going on, but you're not supposed to talk about it in the building because it's negative, right? Well, guess what? It's on everybody's mind. Everybody knows about it. It's not like it's if you don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. But I do see that some companies take that route and they try to be more secretive about it and try to kind of keep the lid on it, right? That's kind of the term that we hear people talk about. And I don't think that's appropriate. I think you face this thing head on. And perfect example is my company that I work for right now. Um, they've had numerous calls, right? Some may have heard 19,000 people going to be laid off over the next 18 months for Accenture. It's the company that I work for. And trust me, I've been stressed about it. But they are having numerous conference calls, like numerous calls at different levels of the company, within different pods of the company, different areas of the company, as many as possible. And they're discussing this and they're saying, here's what to expect. Here's what's going to happen, and here's what already has happened, and here's why it had to happen. And really we're very transparent, and I just saw people that even through the screen, people are coming in, their shoulders are hiked up, they look stressed out. And even as this meeting went on, you just see people get a little bit more relaxed, right? It was only 2.5% of the workforce that was getting laid off. Now don't get me wrong, that's awful, that's terrible for that 2.5%. But the reality of the situation is that 90, here coming with math again, 97.5% of
Mm.
people are not going to be impacted. But guess what? Those 97.5% of people have been stressed to the gills because they were worried they were part of that. So just by talking about it and then really explaining things and how it's all going to work and who are the people that are potentially going to be laid off, that really helped out. So advice for the owners, for the leaders, is to really pay attention and be transparent about it. And remember, it's not just about the people that are being laid off. It's also about the people that are being left behind, that are staying, that are going through that in the same way.
Well, it's a human event, And I mean, think about it. You have a coworker that you've become very close to, and you're spending every day with them on some level. And then at a given point, they're gone. It doesn't mean you can't reach out other times, other ways, but the relationship is remarkably impacted. And I mean, we're talking loss getting close to akin to death as far as the emotional impact. And and so there are just so many parts of this that really make a difference and factor into it. And those making the decision and implementing them have the emotional part as well, because in some cases, these are people that they've become friends with, and they're having to deliver this hard news. And so your stress levels are just remarkable in these cases, and how to recover in terms of the stress. Anton, it might be worthwhile kind of doing a very brief on the cycle of stress and recovery. By the way, welcome, Sharon. Always good to hear from you. So, what maybe do a brief description on the cycle of stress so people can kind of get a reminder of that. It's been a while since we mentioned it.
Yeah, it's a great call out, Kev. When we talk about stress, right? Me and Kevin like to talk about it as a bucket analogy, right? And when we talk about the water represents the stress, and the amount of water is the amount of stress that's flowing in. And everybody has a certain capacity, right? Some people have a really big bucket, and there's many reasons for it. We call that resilience, right? So when you have a big capacity to handle that water, your bucket's big, you're considered to be a resilient person. But it doesn't matter how big it is, doesn't matter how small it is, if the inflow is greater than outflow, irrelevant of how much greater, over time, inevitably that water is going to start to spill over. And when that water starts to spill over, that's when you start to have issues. And we call this burnout, right? When the water is overflowing, we are burnt out. And there's many side effects of it. We've covered it many times. I'm not going to get too deep into it right now, but that's just the thing. So with layoffs, think about all the different things that have been causing water to flow in. And your body has natural ways of getting rid of it. Your sleep. When you sleep, your body, think about it as like a sinking boat, perhaps, and somebody's like sitting there dumping the water out overboard so it doesn't sink. Well, think about that. Your body's during sleep, good quality sleep. And I know some of our guests don't enjoy that. Like I know for a fact there's a few of us on here that have struggled with sleep. We've talked about that. And your body's not able to dump it out at a rate that it should normally do. So then things that it could sustain before, now it can't. Now all of a sudden you add layoffs to it, and that's a full-on faucet that's turned on. It's not like a slow trickle in of water. It's a really high level of water intake. So suggestion for those that are going through this, you have to be at your best during this period of time, because you have to put on this face of, a go-getter and a doer and a capable person to go get your next role, next job. But if that water starts to overflow, it becomes really tough. And I've seen this happen with clients too, who lose their jobs, and all of a sudden they're not really looking for work very much. And you're thinking, like, why? Like, why aren't you trying out there, going and kicking and screaming and pushing as hard as you can to get back on track? They're burnt out. So what we don't think about when it comes to burnout is loss of hope. That's one of the things that happens when we're burnt out. We consider it depression, and many people will go that route, but it doesn't always mean it's actual clinical depression. Many similar systems, many similar biomarkers and things like that happening in the body, but it's actually burnout. It's not because something happened that you'd be depressed about. It's because your body's just been overflowing water for a really long time. And instead of going that route, you need to figure out, what are other outlets that it can take the water out, right? Maybe I start meditating, maybe I start praying, maybe I start to go for walks, maybe I start to watch my diet. And really, I look at it holistically and I think, what are all the different things that are adding stress to my bucket? And another thing that me and Kevin talk a lot about is, which ones of these are controllable, right? I got laid off. I can't control that. That's something that's going to stress me out for a while. But there's many choices that we're making on a daily basis that are causing us to be stressed out. And
Mm-hmm.
many of them are very hidden. Nutrition is one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we need to talk about nutrition at some point and how it connects to stress, because we haven't done that in a while. But just think about sugar intake, processed carbohydrates, processed foods, chemicals in foods, pesticides, whatever you name it, all that stuff that either A, doesn't belong in our body, or B, doesn't belong at the capacity that we take it in. Another good one of those is coffee. As much as we love it, it is a stressor in our systems, right? So all these other little inflows, we have to take a look and say, what can I do to minimize those as much as possible, while I do more things than I used to do to create the outflow. And that way I can stay balanced as a human being. I can be at my best self. So while I'm looking for work, I can sustain this long period of time without really hitting bottom. If that's the summary, the summary works for you.
Yeah, and think about it. The better your general condition from a stress standpoint is, the better you're going to be prepared for those times when the faucet opens up and dumps stress on you. I think of an example, kind of an extreme, but you're on a ship and the ship's going down, and you don't end up in a lifeboat, so you've got to tread water. And if you're physically already in good shape, you have a much greater chance of lasting treading water than if you are completely out of shape. And so, again, being prepared from a stress management standpoint, and something that I like to remind people, we do not espouse the idea of living stress free. That is, first of all, it's impractical. Second of all, it's unhealthy. What we talk about is to manage stress in a healthy fashion. And there's ways to go about it. And one of the first things to do is to understand what are your core stressors. And so we are always looking to help people figure out what are those core stressors, getting down to the root issues and begin to address one of those. Doesn't have to be all of them. One of those as we move forward to begin to build, as Anton said, the resilience. The more that we are healthy in our general life, then the greater our bucket is to manage, or larger our bucket, I guess, is to manage the stress inputs without overflowing. So really take and consider what is going on as you're dealing with this. So if, for example, you're not a part of a layoff now, but your company is doing layoffs, one of the best things you can do is begin to look at your stress management in general, even if it's not directly involved with a layoff, but dealing with the whole picture, and really encourage you to explore that. And in the not too distant future, we're going to roll back out our stress assessment on the web that will be available for you to take and see where you are from a stress management standpoint. Welcome, Karen. Always glad to have you with us and appreciate it. And those of you that are with us, please let us know that you're there, and please share your thoughts. Let us know, are you dealing with impacts from the layoff, either directly or indirectly, and how you're coping with it? Because at the end of the day, that's what we've got to understand. What do we do in order not to get to a condition of burnout? Because stress will do that. And the implications and consequences of those that burnout is remarkable. I mean, I've literally seen burnout so extreme that it costs people their life, and it's really sad and scary. So, Anton, what are some tips that we can talk about? You mentioned a little bit. What are some others we can talk about to help manage stress in general, but in particular about layoffs?
Yeah, before I dive into it, I just want to emphasize a point that you make, and it's fortifying yourself, right? So
Mm.
fortifying yourself in a different way. So think about what we do, and I'm saying this because I'm actually doing it. I mean, when you hear your company's going 19,000 layoffs, you're going to fortify a little bit. So what am I doing? I'm saving a little bit more than I would. I'm cutting costs a little bit more than I would.
Mm,
Even though I'm not, I don't think I'm really in danger, but it's smart to do that. It just makes sense. And I think everybody on the call with right now will be like, yeah, that makes sense. But what are we all doing to fortify our mind, body, and spirit
mm,
before we get into the place where it's going to be under attack, right? Before we get to that huge inflow of water into our body. It's not a common practice. It's nobody really talks about that. We're very reactive with it. Once we get close to burnout or we are burnt out, then we start doing things to correct. But telling you, when the water starts to overflow, your ability to control that is much worse than when that water is still under control inside that bucket. So
mm,
fortify yourself by starting taking care of your health, by starting taking care of your mental health, your physical health, not just one, but both combined. And burnout is another, we've used the word burnout numerous times. How often do we talk about burnout from people not doing too much, right? We don't think about burnout that way in society. Right now, the current view of burnout is I'm doing too much. I'm being asked too much at work. And my schedule's too long. My workload's too big, whatever it may be. Burnout is not just going to come from that. If your mind is constantly spinning and racing because of fear of layoffs, potential of layoffs, being in the middle of layoffs, right? You may not be doing a lot, but you sure can get burnt out just the
mm,
same way as if you're working 12-hour days, 6, 7 days a week, because your mind is still working at that capacity, even though physically you're not doing as many of those things. So just think about that, because that's some of the shifts that we have to make as a society. We have to really change the way we look at burnout as just something
mm,
that comes from doing. Burnout can come from just being. People that have
mm.
medical conditions can get burnt out because their body's always dealing with something, even though they're not doing stuff all the time. So fortify yourself and change the way you think about burnout. But we talked about the leaders that are doing the layoffs, but the people that are experiencing layoffs, trust me, they're having it worse than anybody, at least in my opinion. And one of the things that I'm going to bring up is just again an old concept that me and Kevin taught for many, many, many years now. Um, but it's control what you can control,
Mm,
influence what you can, and let go of what you can't. The reality is, majority of the stress that we experience when we think about layoffs, or even when we're experiencing layoffs, comes from the uncontrollable stress.
mhm,
And what I would do if I was in that situation, and I hope everybody understands, I'm being empathetic, but at the same time, I'm always going to push people towards action. Like if somebody's hit rock bottom, my philosophy is keep swimming as hard as you can to get out of there, right? You don't want
mhm,
to spend much time there. So create a journal and say,
mm,
create a plan, whatever you want to call it, and say, what does a good active day look like for me? And I mean active as in like from doing all the things that I want to do in a day to feel that even though I don't have a job, what is it going to make me feel
mm,
accomplished at the end of that day? Like I'm on track to where I feel better. Why? Because hope is powerful. Hope, a light at the end of the tunnel, is really, really powerful to keep you from burning out, to keep you from getting to a really bad spot and depression and things like that. So then you write out those things, and at the end of the day, you go and say, did I do the things that I said I was going to do? Did I put in an X amount of applications? Did I network with X amount of people? Did I take care of my health? Did I do some stress management stuff? Did I eat well? Whatever those things are, um, we need to make sure that we've taken care of that. Then influencing. What are the things that I don't necessarily control, but what are the things that I can influence, right? Whether it be conversations, some actions, a smaller list. And then the last list is what are the things that I can't do anything about?
mm.
Macroeconomic conditions I cannot control, but guess how many of us are stressing about it, right? So think about it in that way and break it down into those three categories and then act on them. And yes, you can't act on things that you can't control, but what you can do is work through those things, identify them that way and say, you know what? Yes, this is a stressor, but I'm not going to preoccupy my thought with it because I've clearly worked through and I've realized that there's nothing I can do about it. I'm doing all the things that I can. I'm doing all the things I can influence, but I can't do nothing about it. I got to let it go.
Well, and I think one of the challenges we face culturally is that uh, we spend a lot of energy and effort being exposed to the things that we cannot control or even influence. And that just the fact that we stay exposed to them will cause us to struggle. And so There are moments where we need to isolate ourselves from some of these things. Doesn't And I know people go, oh, well, stick your head in the sand. No, not at all. But if you can't control it and you can't influence it, but yet you continue to process it, you are bringing stress to yourself that you're not intended to deal with. The interesting thing is that we can, as a human, we are prepared. We're designed to manage and cope with stress. That is a given. The question becomes, are we managing or coping with stress in ways that we need to? And one of those things is to avoid the things that are potentially stressful that we can't do anything about. We can't influence, we can't impact. We don't even have the tools to cope with them. And I think as a culture, where a lot of people are there, by the way we choose to live and expose ourselves. Indian Academy of Entrepreneurship has a question for us, Anton.
It's a great question. Do we really need to opt for layoffs to save a business? And this is where the answer is not that simple, right? It depends on individually on what the company is and what the company is doing, right? Sometimes companies make layoffs. A lot of the tech giants we're looking at make layoffs not because they ran out of, cash. It's because they are a publicly traded company and they have to show a certain level of profitability. And when it doesn't happen, stakeholders are upset. The stock price starts to go down, all this kind of stuff. And that's a complicated beast, right? From somebody that is not an owner, is not an investor necessarily. Like, we look at him and go, why can't you just cut profits and go to not really being a profitable company for a little bit, pay all your bills, pay everything, and make that happen? But sometimes when stock prices start to tank, it's like a snowball effect that starts to get created, right? And there's so many unforeseen things that get piled into that snowball, and you think like, oh yeah, we could just run a net neutral profit and be okay for a while and keep all our people. But that snowball can get to a point where you can't slow it down later. And really understand how these mega giant companies work is well beyond me. But I know that there's a lot of complexities that us average folks, we think it's simple, but it's not. Now, do I think that some of them mismanaged their company and overhired because things were great and they were thinking that things were going to be great for a long time? I absolutely agree. When you grow during pandemic, I think Facebook grew 93% headcount over the course of the pandemic, right? Just that's astronomical for a company that's already big. It's not a small mom and pop shop that went and hired, 3 people and they had 2 people before and then they had that kind of growth. No, this was a massive company. It's been around for a long time and it grew 93%. And things were good. Things were great, right? But if they're doing that, they should have been prepared on the back end when this stops. What are we going to do? But the good thing is, like, a lot of these companies that are doing these layoffs, they're providing good exit strategies for people, right? They're providing good compensation packages. They're helping with transition. They're helping with mental health. Some of the good ones are doing that. Now, on the other hand, there is smaller companies that are not necessarily that big. And I don't think it's always necessary, because I think that if you are a great leader, and I mean really great leaders could probably do this, and this is just, I'm spitballing right now because I'm pondering this question. You could uplift productivity, right? I know that if one human came to another human and said, person left and right next to you may not be here tomorrow. How do we join hands? How do we come together and improve everything we're doing, and we squeeze out everything we can out of everything we can, and get to a point where we protect these people by improving our output, doing more with less? That's a big thing that Microsoft is talking about right now for the last quarter. I've listened to a few of their earnings. I've listened to a few of their presentations, and that's a big term, doing more with less, because that's what it's ultimately going to take. We have less intake, right? If we can figure out as a company how we can use less but still do more, which sucks for a lot of times, you are more stressed, but guess what? We get to keep the people. And that has to be a community decision for not just one leader, not just one team. Everybody has to be culturally going, okay, we have to figure out how to do that and how to squeeze all the juice out of this orange possible in order to keep our people. And if we can do that collectively, then I think that layoffs are not necessary. But is that possible? Is that feasible for all companies? I don't think so.
Well, and something that occurs to me is people sometimes don't consider the difference between layoffs and being fired. Layoffs are a more human way of releasing people. And a couple of things to consider in there. First of all, by its very definition, a layoff is not terminal. The idea is a layoff is such that if things improve, the goal would be to recover those people. And so just doing a layoff versus a mass firing is just something that is really important to really think about. And we just need to uh, really look at that and keep it in perspective that layoffs, by their very nature, are more humane than just a mass firing. So, really look at it in that fashion. Are there other ways? Of course, there are other ways. Because the bottom line is the reason for a layoff is the work is not there, production's low, whatever. And so at the end of the day, there are different ways to approach maintaining either productivity or containing costs or improving outputs, whatever. There are different ways. But when you get to a point, if things go unaddressed, then you go from risking a small amount of people to a greater amount because, like Anton said, there's a snowball effect that goes on, and if you don't get uh, in front of that snowball, it'll run right over you, and the results will be a lot worse. So, to answer the question, yeah, is there? Do we have to do that? No. Is it the best in some cases? It is, and it's more humane than just cutting the workforce by X amount because the implications morally and legally difference between layoffs and firing. So just something.
Layoffs are done poorly, right? If layoffs are done poorly, it feels like people were fired,
Yeah, it does.
and
Right.
sometimes it happens like that. But there's also ways that layoffs are done well, right? And
Right.
a lot of times, many of these people, the thing is, like, here's the other side, and like I know I keep defending the business side, but I think that's just what we don't talk about enough. And say you push off these layoffs as long as you can, right? But you go to a point where you are really in a tight spot financially. And then instead of giving people a long runway, it becomes a short, abrupt thing.
Mm,
We don't even have severance package money left now. And people are like, well, why didn't you do it before? Well, we didn't do it before because everybody thought we were going to be the bad employer that had to lay people off. But if you start doing it early, you still have the funding to give these people a smooth transition and give them ability to find better jobs. Do the layoffs while the macroeconomic conditions haven't gotten too bad. Like right now, as much as it sucks that layoffs are happening and as terrible as it is, the labor market is great still. We're
mm,
still at a near all-time low unemployment. That means that if we do this right, these people will land on their feet. But if companies just don't do the things that they have to do, and they don't call what many companies call manage their business, if they're not managing their business, it's going to come to a point where the thing's going to snap. And if
mm,
that thing snaps, when the macroeconomic conditions, labor market are in a bad state, well, guess what? It's also a snowball effect. Now the labor market is going to come down and crash even faster because there's so much supply all of a sudden at the same
mm,
time while the demand is dropped, right? So do these things early. And that's something that we talk about, from firing standpoint. Hire fast, fire early is one of the biggest things you'll hear is entrepreneurship. Indian Academy of Entrepreneurship. I'm sure you've heard this term. That's the reality of running a good business is you for many reasons. Firing a person early is humane even for that person sometimes
mm.
if they're in a bad role. I don't mean firing them out of the company, finding them a different role if possible. But if we just wait and we don't proactively act on these things, there's going to come a time where we're going to be reacting to these things, and it's going to hurt the company and the person more. So, there's two sides to the coin. Layoffs suck. They create a lot of stress, but at the same time, they're a necessary evil for most companies. Now,
Hmm.
companies that don't even try to do it the right way. They're like, all right, we're just going to cut staff, and it's just it's a financial decision. There's no human consideration to it, and they do it very poorly. So I don't want to sound like everybody's doing it great, but there are plenty of companies that are.
Well, and just to go back to a foundational concept, the best thing you can do is to work on managing your stress now, period. Both whether you're involved in layoffs or not. Certainly, if there is the potential that you're going to be involved in a layoff, then that's even more important that you are looking at baseline management of your stress in your life. And if you do that, you're building resilience in yourself. You cannot control the company, but you can control what you do and your choices you make. And when you are proactive and healthy, if it happens, you have a much greater chance of not only surviving, but thriving. Because in some of these cases, layoffs are really helping us to make a decision we needed to make anyway. It's just kind of forcing our hand a little bit. That's where a lot of entrepreneurs come from. They were in a situation where they were employed and then layoffs occurred, and they ultimately landed on their feet by being entrepreneurs, and they wouldn't have done that had they not been pushed a bit. So again, please be working on stress management in your life. We are convinced that stress is as much a killer of people as other aspects that we give more heed to. Yes, it's important to be as physically healthy as possible, but you can be physically healthy and not manage stress and die of heart failure tomorrow. We see it happen. I've had friends that have done that. And so we've got to be holistically healthy and holistically prepared to deal with stress in our lives. That's how you're going to be resilient. And we know the market is such right now that it's going on around us. So uh, if we wait till it happens, we are then in a more difficult place to respond. We are, as Anton was saying, reacting. Not a healthy place in life, period. The older I get, the more I learn, more I realize that the best way to um, uh, deal with life's challenges is not to react, but to respond, and not just respond, but have measured responses. And you can start now developing your measured responses if you take the time to. So, we would like to have you part of the human SOS movement. Uh, Anton and I can't do it alone. We've been at this now, wow, over 3 years, right? Coming up on 3 years.
No, just because it says 148, we've skipped a few weeks, and obviously we didn't start doing the show right away. So
Right.
the human SOS has existed more than 3 years, and
Right. Oh, that's right. Because we went a year or so before we even had the show. So,
it's a
point
slow
is,
process. I mean, it's something that I knew getting into this, that it's gonna take time, because I constantly come back of comparing to sustainability of the planet. How long did it take us to talk about it before we started acting on it? Decades. So me and Kevin are just trying to do what we can, and we're asking your help, to follow the hashtag human
Mhm.
SOS. That's his first step. Share content and use the hashtag human SOS to just people to start paying attention and going, what is that? What is a humanly sustainable operating system, right? Whether it be for an individual, whether it be for an entrepreneur, whether it be for a company, there's ways that we can do things that are sustainable for our mind, body, and spirit. And we
Mm.
have to first learn what that looks like. We have to create awareness. We have to get people asking questions. And all of you joining this call on a regular that I see, thank you. Because
Mm.
not for you, I say this all the time. Me and Kevin would have stopped a long time ago, right? We could not possibly talk to an empty room for 3 years and feel like we're making a difference. And that's what gets us keep showing up. So please join the hashtag. Please create content with it. Tag us in it, ask us questions with it. We'll jump in and add value to your content. But we just need to keep trying to spread the awareness around it because things are not going to get better, folks. I'm telling you, you're going to see more and more articles over the next 5, 10 years that are somehow, some way related to human beings not living in a sustainable way to their mind, body, and spirit.
And by the way, if you need someone to help you or your organization to work through to become humanly sustainable operating system, we're here. We're open to that. We will get together with you to discuss the needs and the approach. And so, if that's a need, reach out. Either Anton or myself will be happy to schedule a discovery call, see if we can be of some value to you or your organization. That's a part of it. So I don't see any more comments, questions at this point, Anton. I think we will wrap this one up, but please build your resilience now in case you get more directly affected. Certainly have your resilience so that if you find someone else floating in the water, that you can offer them a hand too. So, final thoughts, Anton?
I mean, it's like you said, build your resilience while you can. But if you're unfortunately in a situation where you're dealing with that already, you're not going to be able to build your resilience. This is more survival mode. But don't forget to take care of your mind, right?
Mm.
Take care and protect the thing that's going to keep you going on this track, keep you going to until you do find a job. Reach out to folks, talk to people, get a support system. You're not in it alone. That's the
Mm.
reality. No matter what, there's going to come a time where you're going to look back on this very difficult, very challenging part of your life, and you're going to see that you've grown, you changed, and you're in a better place now than you were before. That's something that I can promise you. And if you need to reach out to us, reach out to us.
God bless. Have an amazing week. We'll see you next week back here Tuesday, 8 o'clock a.m. for the Human SOS show. And we'll take on a new topic generally around sustaining humanly. So thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye now.